what I want to do is to look at this in a perspective that's going to begin to reflect, as this morning's talks, on the issues in front of us in terms of the future direction of policy and the positioning of landscapes within this. I hope it will have resonance for this morning's debates around the 25-year plan and around the landscapes review, while coming from the background of the work I've done as me. Basically, first of all, what do we actually mean by a seminar? It's been introduced as this mysterious Welsh concept. It's not really. It's a pretty good international concept, but it is the phrase that the lawyers use in defining that section of the Act, which I will show as my last slide, because you really don't want it after lunch. A whole section of legislation about what we meant by the new duties that we're introducing in the Environment Act. So first of all, under legislation, the key thing is to pursue the positive resilience of ecosystems as a whole, rather than simply protecting specific areas for conservation. So it relates back to, it is about the whole land, it's about the whole system, it is not about having little bits that you can protect on their own and forget about the rest. It's about the whole system. So that's the main, and it's about not increasing the resilience of the system for the long term. So the aim of and the duty on the public bodies that the Act refers to is to engage in management of that increases resilience and delivers wider social benefits. And that includes issues that we've touched on this morning, including nature-based solutions and the like. But it's both the ecosystem health, if you like, itself, and then the services that ecosystem provides. So you're about capturing both. In that sense, it's also essentially about the integration, as we've heard this morning, of the different aspects. It's not about any one thing. It's about thinking about how those systems of the way the land is managed, the communities that live in that space. So this is not new to us in the family of OMBs, but it's nice to actually have it in statute for a change. It's definitely not just about ecosystem services. Very little of the Welsh stuff relates to ecosystem services. It talks about the ecosystem approach. It's about the concept of it. What we found is that a lot of people are jumping to services and forgetting the ecosystem. So we need to watch that. It's not just about the biodiversity and conservation, it's about the linkages to those other factors that drive it. And it's not just about the aesthetic. We can use beauty, we can use those phrases, they're important, but it's about the whole structure. So as I threaten at the end, I'll show you the legal definition of this in the Wales Environment Act, linking to our well-being goals that are in the 2015 Wellbeing Future Generations Act. But of course, these concepts are well established, they're good ecological concepts. They're also in the Convention on Biological Diversity and in the international platform, the international academic platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So what does that mean for us as people who are interested in managing the landscape? Well, I would argue it's the end of that 1940s model, where we divided, like Caesar and Gaul, we divided the land into different parts. There was going to be town and country, there was going to be forestry, there was going to be agriculture, there was going to be pretty areas, and there was going to be nature areas. That's what we did in the 1940s Act. And that stood us in very good stead in terms of preserving some of those contexts. But it means we've created these disjunctions, these separations, particularly the urban-rural split that we talked about this morning. It means that it is about working at a landscape scale. This is strongly place-based. We are well placed for this. Ecosystem sustainability only makes sense in place. Place is what connects those things that go on, that connect the economic, the social, environmental. It makes it real for people, not conceptual. So place is really important, and it cannot be one size fits all. It has to be spatial. It's essentially outside the red lines. We talked earlier on about working outside the boundaries, but the issues that we're facing are those that are essentially outside the red lines. It's not simply the protections, it's about how the system as a whole functions. And again, we touched on this morning, it's about very different approaches to governance and knowledge. It has to be flexible. It has to be local. It has to connect issues rather than keep them apart. It has to be essentially collaborative, which is how you operate. And above all, this concept of co-production, so that we're bringing the different players in, having those discussions together, determining what matters, not from a particular expert perspective, but bringing all our knowledges and all our understandings of these places together into one. I think one of the things we found doing this work is the question of how ready we are. And I think this is something you'll need to confront as you think about where you want to position yourselves for the reviews and the other works going on. So one of the really difficult things is this is essentially a less certain world. We've been used to being behind the line and defending the line and occasionally not even doing that very well. And this is about saying, actually, there's a bigger prize here if we can work more flexibly. But that's a nervous space to be in. It's nice to hang on to the certainties that you've got and to have that, nowhere special, hands-off sort of approach. Defence is the position we've been in for a long while. To actually sort of go on the offence in this area, though I like the idea of a minimum of GDP being spent in this area. It's not what we've been used to for decades. For some of the colleagues I work with, and people like flood engineers, and like this is really difficult because this is a whole nature-based solution. It's a very difficult area. This whole sense. They've all been taught to conquer nature. That was the Victorian achievement. We got rid of nature. We sort of put everything in the water came in tubes and the trains and the rest of it. So we distance ourselves through the system of industrialisation from these issues. So that's a really tricky one for those. For policymakers, and we've heard this again this morning, it actually means about getting local and to enabling local. It's not top-down. This does not work top-down. It has to be local. And particularly when we've seen the hollowing out of a lot of the organisations, the need to work locally and to work collaboratively and to get bottom-up solutions, I think is a really central part of this, because it just does not lend itself to. And one of the risks is, of course, people are used to running top-down schemes. It will be very easy to see a future agriculture scheme look a bit like the same box-ticking exercise that the old ones are. And for the land-based industries, it means embracing a broader world. So it might mean about doing things other than food and fibre, which increasingly has been part of the reality for farms, but has not really felt like the real beating heart of it. And certainly in the Welsh context, if it isn't about the livestock, it isn't proper. It's, that's what you do. You have the sheep, you have the small amount of beef. So that's really, really tricky, and it's really part of the identity. And also it may mean doing different things. We heard earlier on about the degree of the threat to light land, for example, that is structural as well as a Brexit threat. So it may be looking at different systems of agriculture, different uses, and that's difficult because a lot of this is about traditional forms, values that people have. One of the things that struck me, particularly now doing the moving to the academic, is the issue of language and how we speak about these things and how we work together. I'm absolutely convinced that this can only happen if we have the big partnerships at a landscape scale between all the players, and that we have very frank and open discussions. So one of the things I've been doing over the last year as part of my fellowship has been working with partnerships in the Brecon Beacons National Park area. Sorry, I mentioned national parks. Which has got fairly developed, but at different scales and different partnerships that have different funding, to get away from this very economic model of partnerships and to begin to understand the motivations, what people felt about the area. And that's been a very interesting piece of work. So I will briefly show you a little bit of that. So you might want to look to see where your favourite term sits on this graphic. This is actual words used by the project, but they've been grouped by a particular form of environmental psychology distinction between how you talk about the rural areas. Broadly, a sort of sense that there's a sort of utility value on the one side. There's a sort of the agrarian community, the sort of rootedness. There's the explorers, or the some of which is the language you have been using today. It's interesting, and we'll be using tomorrow. And then there's a group in the middle that may or may not be common language around this. So it's been quite interesting to explore this, because what are we talking about here? What do we value? Each of these phrases, each of these words means something different. And in particular, I don't think anybody in the farming interviews mentioned wilderness. It's an existential issue, that is. It's the last thing you want is wilderness. And while there was a lot of overlap, a lot of people did talk about the agrarian community's issues who weren't from those areas because it was part of the role. It probably wasn't a strong feeling. What was interesting was that the strongest sentiments across the board were about, and that were in common, were about sense of place. It was about that attachment to the place and the characteristics, very common characteristics that people expressed about the nature of the integration between the people living there, their activities and the landscape. And I think that's what we're fundamentally about. I mentioned the Wellbeing Act earlier on, so one of the things we did was to look at how well this mapped in terms of the wider public aspirations we might have for this work. The strongest theme across all of it was about community, interestingly, so linked into the sense of place. Incomes, livelihoods, prosperity, if you like, resilience. Some on health, particularly sort of health benefits of both the food and the water, and also visiting there. Quite a strong cultural one, although largely around issues like Welsh language and traditional activities, I would say. Quite weak on equality. I think that's something you might want to think about more generally. The equality was essentially expressed in poor people visiting. I think it might be a bit more complicated than that. And I think one of the issues for us generally, for me as a sector, is that I think this concept of a place where poor people visit because they have rubbish environments might not be a long-term proposition. I think we need to be engaging with green infrastructure within urban areas, because then people can connect. And think about my childhood growing up in Leicester, you can connect the environment you experience by the canal side with that environment you experience when you go to the Peak District National Park. So leave you with that thought. And almost nothing on international. So again, quite interesting. So, challenges. First of all, future schemes. We've sort of speculated on this in both a Brexit and a 25-year strategy. So, common risk, I think, is the issue about traditional forms of agriculture, particularly the upland family farm, which is pretty defining of a lot of our upland landscapes and a lot of the grassland landscapes that we manage. So, big issue there. However, there is this promising focus on landscape scale action in the UK document, and also in the new Welsh document that was published last week. This week? No, last week. However, some caveats here, and I think these are relevant to positioning. If you look at health and harmony, for me it does still split things up. There's a sort, and to a certain extent the Welsh one as well. There's this landscape that's about landscape. There's this landscape that's about nature. There's this landscape that's for production. And they're in different chapters, and they don't really cross-refer. And I just wonder to what extent we have moved on, or whether, and the Welsh one just goes landscape production. It's kept it simpler. But I think I'm just a little anxious. And I think in that context I'm anxious because I think part of the offer that you might be being given at the moment is a nostalgic one. I'm worried that you're being offered 1949. 1949 on steroids. Just wonder whether you want 1949 on steroids, or whether the world is a little bit different and you want something a little subtler. I'll leave you with that thought. Focus on agricultural productivity, a bit worrying, the top-down framing in that, and this whole issue about the monetarisation that came through very strongly earlier in the particularly the Cameron era, which links into things like the natural capital and the other phrases. So we haven't used natural capital as a phrase in Wales. We've talked about getting finance for nature. Actually, is more or less more like it. I don't really care if it's the right amount of money as long as it can buy something. Okay, so opportunities. So put onto a slide before I give you the long one. From all the work I've been doing, I think this issue of place-based partnership working is absolutely central. It connects with people, it connects the issues together. In particular, I think the sense of place, and you've got it in spades in the areas that you work in, is a really strong motivational factor. It makes these links, and it's a call to a different set of emotions. It's around the social, cultural, the aesthetic, not the pure economic that we get told we have to do all the time. I think that's quite a powerful one in terms of the way that expresses. I think the sense of empowerment, if we really can have a bottom-up approach to landscape schemes, where those local priorities and knowledge build offers, which can then form contracts with governments, but not just contract with governments. In the Brecon Beacons, we're working strongly with Canterbury, the water company. Half of its water comes from that catchment. It has a very good reason to be part of financing that. So we might even see a situation where the principal financer might actually be a commercial one, with government standing in to get added benefits from it. I think that changes the whole dynamic of whether this subsidy culture that we've got into over the years. It's quite interesting. And that really strong sense of ownership. The number of times somebody said these fools who come in from outside and tell me what to do and have no idea what this land is and how it's managed, particularly the graziers. Just this sort of sense of the disconnect there. And the last disconnect we touched on again today is this whole issue of reconnecting the urban and rural. It has been the triumph of industrialisation that we have separated those two things. Production and consumption completely separated. Even increasingly within rural areas, the number of people I interviewed has said not even the kids in the local school are all clear where the food comes from in a rural area. So we're in a really interesting period, and all the people I interviewed felt deep pride in what they did, deep heritage, including the water company who were proud of the Victorian forefathers who built all that kit. And then nobody knew what on earth they did and what it was for. There was no connection. So really, really powerful in terms of that. I think that's, if we can do that. And that links back to my idea of actually making sure we're doing work in urban areas, not simply inviting out urban areas to visitors. And then, in summary really, you're in a really good place for this. I don't think you should become national parks. Nobody likes the planner, I have to say. That was a universal. The two things people didn't like was planning rules and conservation rules. I thought they were both rubbish, uniformly across everybody interviewed. So you may not want that. However, because of your more flexible structures and your ability to work with people, you are absolutely in this space. So keep that. Ask for some more bite, but keep that sort of nimbleness, keep that spirit, because I think that is where the future lies. It's not being in a body apart; it's in a part of the system. What I would do, and I'll go back to just talk about the Welsh stuff, is the idea that we might give the special qualities legal status in themselves, so that they were binding on other bodies, which is sort of the equivalent of giving it to the management plan, but actually taking it up a level, so that you're actually putting the fundamental nature of the designation as at the centre of what others do, is something you might want to look at. I think if giving more bite to your nature rather than giving more influence to you as bodies, I think is probably a stronger route into this. I'll leave you with that thought. And, as I threatened, the Environment Wales Act 2016, which is where the sustainable management definition comes from. It's not too long. There won't be a test on it later. But if you
give 2-minute warning.
That's fine. I'm not going to do it. But it's there. We're the first jurisdiction worldwide to legislate on an ecosystem approach, put it into law. So this was our attempt to describe what ecosystem resilience was and how that related to other benefits. I won't say it's perfect. law is an imperfect business, law making is even more imperfect. But that's our attempt to do that, and I wish you well for your interesting few years. Thank you.